had planned the hike for almost 3 months. My schedule had been packed with work and deadlines, and I needed time away from the city noise. Hiking had always been a way for me to disconnect from everything. I wasn't one of those hikers who shared everything on social media or took drone shots at every turn. I just liked walking through trees, listening to birds, watching clouds change over distant peaks, just being out there alone. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, something more remote. It was located in the northern part of the state, near a place called Signal Creek. The name sounded made up, but it was on the maps, and that was enough for me. The trail looped through forested ridges, crossed a few streams, and had one main climb up a narrow ridgeline that looked sharp and exposed but beautiful. I saw online that the trail wasn't too popular, 1 or 2 trip reports from a couple of years ago, some GPS files, not much else. That was a good sign. I wanted solitude. I left early on a Saturday morning. The sky was gray when I started driving, the kind of gray that doesn't quite mean rain but doesn't promise sun either. It was a 4-hour drive to the trailhead. When I got there was only one other car parked at the edge of the clearing. An old dusty sedan. I didn't think much of it. Probably someone else out doing a longer route or a hunter. I parked my car, checked my gear, hydration bladder full, backup water bottles, first aid kit, map, GPS, food, everything in order. I had a Garmin InReach Mini clipped to my backpack. I'd let someone back home know I'd be gone 3 days, just in case. That was the plan: hike the full loop over 3 days, camp 2 nights, then hike out on the 3rd day. The trail started off soft and quiet. Pine needles muffled every step. Trees leaned in overhead, and I felt the usual calm that comes in the first hour of being away from roads and buildings. The trail followed a low valley for a while, cutting through ferns and mossy rocks, and then started rising slowly. I passed a few animal prints. Deer mostly, maybe an old bear print in the mud, nothing fresh. By noon, I had climbed about 1,500 feet and came to a clearing where I stopped for lunch. The clouds hadn't broken yet, and everything had this flat gray tone. I didn't mind it, kept the air cool. I ate some crackers and jerky, drank water, and kept moving. The higher I got, the narrower the trail became. By late afternoon, I had reached a ridge that gave me my first wide view of the forest below. The trees stretched for miles, a thick green carpet, and the valley I'd climbed out of looked far away now. I decided to camp on a flat spot just off the ridge. I set up my tent between 2 boulders that offered some shelter from wind. The ground was a little sloped, but I made it work. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind picked up around midnight, and it kept pressing the side of the tent, making a sound like something brushing against the nylon. I knew it was just the wind, but every once in a while it sounded different, like footsteps maybe, or scratching. I told myself not to be paranoid. There were no people out here. It was just trees and animals. By morning, the sky had cleared a little. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, packed up, and started the next leg of the hike. This part climbed along the spine of the ridge, narrow, rocky, with steep drop-offs on either side. I had to use my hands in a few places. There were no ropes or rails, just loose rocks and dirt. I moved slowly. Below me, I could see endless tree cover. Somewhere far in the distance, I could hear the low rushing of a river. Around noon, the trail dipped again and I entered a thicker forest. The trees here were taller and closer together, and the ground was covered in layers of old pine needles and deadfall. I came across an old rusted can nailed to a tree, maybe from decades ago. It had bullet holes in it and a dent in the middle. That was the first strange thing I saw. Just some old trash, but something about it bothered me. I didn't like thinking about guns out here. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a single sign of another person. No boot prints.
No campsites.
No wrappers or human trash. Not even broken branches. It was like no one had come this way in years. That felt odd. Most trails, even remote ones, show some kind of sign. This one didn't, and the deeper I went, the stranger it felt. I crossed a dry creek bed with stacked rocks along one side, like a man-made wall, but half collapsed. Old, maybe even from before this was public land. After that, the trail curved sharply, and I noticed something odd in the dirt, drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled. It looked old, not fresh, but clear. I stopped and studied them. There were also some indentations, deep and wide. Maybe from a tire? But there was no way a vehicle could get up here. I kept going, but my pace slowed. I started looking over my shoulder more. I listened more closely. Every branch snap made me pause. The light through the trees started to dim as clouds rolled back in. That night, I couldn't find a good spot to camp. The forest was too dense and the ground was uneven. I eventually found a place with just enough space between 3 large trees. It wasn't ideal, rocks under the soil and the canopy above blocked most of the sky, but I was tired. I ate a cold dinner, skipped the fire, and got inside my tent before it got too dark. That night was worse than the first. The wind was gone, but the woods felt too quiet. I heard things. Faint crunching, a thump, something shifting nearby. At one point, I thought I saw light flicker through the wall of my tent, but it could have been moonlight or my eyes playing tricks. I didn't unzip it to check. I lay still and waited for morning. When I woke up, there were marks in the dirt near the tent. Indentations like something round had been pressed into the soil. Maybe a rock rolled or something stepped there. It wasn't shaped like a shoe or a paw, just a smooth, deep, round imprint about the size of a bowl. I stared at it for a long time. The last stretch of the trail was supposed to loop back toward the southern end of the ridge and lead me down into a canyon before rejoining the original path. That was what I planned. But the trail markers became harder to follow. Some had been stripped from trees. Others were faded beyond recognition. The GPS worked, but the terrain didn't match the topography I downloaded. The slope was wrong. Distances felt off. I started wondering if the maps were outdated or if I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Then I came to a clearing that wasn't on any map. It was wide and oval-shaped, surrounded by trees that looked older and deader than the rest. In the middle was what looked like the remnants of an old cabin, just a foundation of stone and some rotted wood beams. There was a rusted metal frame nearby, maybe the remains of a bed or a stove. It had been abandoned for a long time. I thought about taking a photo but didn't. Something about it felt off. I started walking around the edge of the clearing when I stepped on something soft. I looked down and saw fabric half buried in the dirt. It was a tattered backpack. I pulled at it and it came loose with a sucking sound. It was old, faded green canvas with frayed straps. Inside were some scraps of paper, rusted tins, and a patch that looked military. I dropped it. My heart was pounding for no reason. I left the clearing fast and got back into the trees. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the idea that I was being watched. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but it felt like something was near. I started walking faster, checking my GPS every few minutes. Still no signal on my phone. The Garmin was working, but even that felt slower, like it was having trouble pinging satellites. Then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Boot prints. Not mine. Not fresh either, but not that old. They were heading the same direction I was going. Wide-soled, deeper in the heel. Someone had been through here maybe a few days ago, maybe less. But why didn't I see any other signs of them? No campsite, no trash, no broken branches? I followed the trail faster. My legs were tired, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I wanted to get out of there. I checked the GPS again. I was still about 9 miles from the trailhead. That was too far for one stretch, but I didn't want to stop again. I thought about texting for help on the Garmin, but didn't want to seem paranoid. I kept walking until the light faded and I had to turn on my headlamp. The forest looked different in artificial light. Every tree felt like it had eyes. I reached a stream and slipped on a rock, soaking my boot. I didn't care. I kept going. Around 10 p.m., I came to a sign nailed to a tree, a metal square, faded and rusted. It said, "Danger, area closed, unmaintained." That wasn't on any map I'd seen. The trail had continued right past it. I paused. I thought about turning back, but back meant deeper woods. I kept going forward. Just past the sign, the trail became overgrown. Branches clawed at my clothes. Thorns scraped my skin. Then I saw it, another boot print. Fresh, clear, right in front of me. That was enough. I used the Garmin to send an emergency ping. started as a solo hiking trip, nothing too fancy or out of the ordinary. I had done dozens before. This time, I wanted something more remote, less touristy. I had taken some time off work and picked out a trail in a less popular area of the state, up near the national forest that bordered on private land. It was about 5 hours from the city, and I had read online that the trail looped through some beautiful ridges, old-growth pine, and stretched over 18 miles with little to no human traffic, especially during weekdays. That was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, peaceful, and empty. I packed like I usually do. Tent, extra tarp, freeze-dried meals, water purification tabs, knife, headlamp, spare batteries, full power bank, printed topographic map, compass, first aid kit, and bear spray. I also brought a light sleeping bag, since nights were supposed to be cold this time of year. I didn't skimp. I've always taken preparation seriously. That's probably why I'd never had any real issues before. The drive there was smooth, dirt roads toward the end, winding through dry pine forest that looked kind of dull from the lack of rain. The weather report said there might be light drizzle at night, but nothing serious. I pulled into a small parking area near the trailhead, maybe room for 4 or 5 cars at most. Mine was the only one. I locked everything up and started my hike mid-morning. The trail was dusty and narrow, the forest silent except for some occasional wind moving through the trees and the far-off tap of woodpeckers. I had planned to do the loop in 2.5 days. Hike 10 miles the first day, camp overnight, hike the rest at a relaxed pace. Nothing rushed. I figured if I moved fast, I could finish early and still have time to relax. I marked my route on the map before setting off, and everything was clear, or so I thought. The first stretch was exactly what I had hoped for. Peaceful. I didn't see a single person all day. No litter, no old campfire rings, not even distant human sounds. It was the kind of isolation that makes you feel calm and focused, but just slightly uneasy, like the feeling you get when swimming in deep water and can't see the bottom. Around 3 p.m., I started looking for a place to camp. The trail had taken me up toward a ridge, and I figured I'd find a flat patch somewhere with some tree cover and decent visibility. I found a place just before sunset that seemed perfect. It was a small clearing about 30 feet off the trail, ringed with old pines and with a patch of grass where I could pitch my tent. The ground was soft but not damp, and I had a good view of the slope down into the trees. I set up camp, boiled some water for my meal, and sat on a small rock eating as the sky turned orange, then purple. The silence at night was heavier. Once the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my jacket and crawled into the tent early. There was no cell signal at all, but I expected that. I had marked where I was on the map and planned to continue west in the morning, following the trail around the loop. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't anything loud, more like something subtle that scratched at the back of your awareness. I laid still for a long time, trying to figure out if I was dreaming. It sounded like a distant crunch, like footsteps, but very slow. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart beating harder than it should have. I turned off my headlamp and listened again. Silence. Then another faint crunch. It was hard to say how far away it was. The forest does strange things to sound. Could have been a deer, or maybe a tree creaking. I laid back down but didn't fall asleep for a long time. I kept thinking of those footsteps, too slow, too spaced apart. Not natural, and they didn't seem to be coming from one direction. One crunch sounded to the west, the next to the north. Or maybe it was the wind. That's what I told myself. The next morning I packed up fast. I didn't want to admit it, but I was rattled. I felt watched. Not constantly, but off and on, like the sensation would fade and then suddenly return with full force. I tried to push it out of my head. I had about 8 miles to cover before the loop started to bend back toward the eastern edge. I told myself once I got through the day, I'd feel better.
I hiket fast.
The trail got steeper, winding along the side of a hill that dropped into thick forest below. I didn't stop for lunch. I just kept moving. I started seeing strange things, and I knew I wasn't imagining them. The first was a tree that had deep gouges in the bark, much too high to be from a bear or elk. They were thin and straight, spaced apart, and didn't look fresh, but not old either. Further along, I found a dead rabbit laid out neatly in the middle of the trail. Its body was intact, but the head was gone. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just lying there like someone had placed it. I stepped around it carefully, making sure I didn't touch it. Not long after, I came to a junction that wasn't on my map. There was a path to the right, not well maintained, but still visible. It looked like it had been used recently. I stared at it for a while, confused. The trail on my map didn't split here. There was only one route. I double-checked the map again, then used the compass to confirm my direction. The fork didn't make sense. I decided to stick to the main path, but the trail got harder to follow. The markers that had been on trees every quarter mile were suddenly gone. The ground was dry and dusty, and it was harder to see where the dirt path went. The trees felt tighter, the light dimmer, even though the sun was still up. I kept moving until I reached a slope that led into a wide gully. That's where I made the biggest mistake of the trip. I followed the slope down, thinking the trail curved with it, but somewhere halfway down I realized I had lost the path. I turned back uphill to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock, every patch of dry grass. It all blurred together. I wasn't on the trail anymore. I stopped moving and forced myself to stay calm. I had a map and compass. I still had food and water. I was off trail, but not lost completely. I marked my spot and began trying to circle back in the direction I came from. But the deeper I moved, the more I realized I couldn't find the trail again. It was like it had vanished. By late afternoon, I gave up trying to find it and decided to set up camp before dark. I found a spot near a large boulder where I could get some shelter from the wind. I didn't cook anything that night, just ate a granola bar and drank water. The silence felt different now, not peaceful anymore, but thick, like the forest itself was waiting. That night was worse than the first. I heard movement, not just once or twice, but again and again. Slow steps, breaking twigs, something brushing against bark. I didn't turn on the light. I just laid in the tent, holding my knife, trying to control my breathing. There was a sound at one point like something dragging across the ground, circling around the tent. I wanted to unzip the flap and look out, but I couldn't make myself do it. I didn't sleep at all. When morning finally came, I packed up and started moving immediately. I picked a direction that would lead me back toward the eastern side of the loop. If I kept going east, I'd eventually cross a trail or reach the old logging road that ran along the park's edge. That was the plan. I moved for hours, climbing over fallen trees, down steep ravines, through brush so thick I had to use my knife to get through. My legs were scratched up, and I tripped more than once. The forest looked more overgrown here, less like a place people ever came through. I found old signs of logging at one point, stumps, rusted wire, and what looked like a piece of broken equipment, half buried in dirt. That gave me some hope. It meant I wasn't completely deep in wilderness. I kept going. Late in the day, I found another strange thing. It was a small structure, maybe the size of an outhouse, made of wood and sheet metal. It looked abandoned and almost collapsed, covered in moss and rot. But there were marks on the door, long, thin scratches that had stripped the wood clean. There was no handle.
No windows.
Just a door, slightly open. I didn't go inside. I just kept moving. That night, I didn't set up a tent. I found a small overhang of rock and laid under it in my sleeping bag, trying to stay hidden. The sounds came again. Movement, heavy breathing, something moving between the trees. I didn't look. I didn't want to know what it was. I just kept the knife in my hand and waited for dawn. On the fourth day, I finally found the old road. It was overgrown, more like a wide animal path than anything usable. But I followed it, limping, exhausted, almost out of water. I kept going for hours, not stopping. Eventually, I came to a gate made of rusted wire and posts. Beyond it was a dirt path that looked maintained. I climbed over the gate and followed the path. After what felt like forever, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Real, not some hallucination. I dragged myself toward it, and to my relief, there was an old man chopping wood out front. He didn't speak, just stared at me as I walked up. I pointed back toward the forest, then toward my empty water bottle. I didn't plan the hike too far ahead. I just packed my backpack the night before, tossed in some trail mix, a water filter, a folding knife, a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and some protein bars. I had my old hiking boots, the ones with worn soles but still enough grip, and my light jacket tied to the straps. The weather had been decent for days, and there wasn't anything in the forecast that worried me. It was mid-fall, the air just starting to get that colder bite, but nothing that felt dangerous. I figured I'd head out to a ridgeline trail I had read about in an old hiking blog. Nothing famous, just a loop in the backcountry forest about 30 miles from where I lived. It wasn't listed on any official state park maps. That's probably what made it appealing to me. The trail didn't even have a real name. The blog just called it the North Ridge Spur. It mentioned a few forks and landmarks but said that parts of the trail got narrow and weren't well maintained. It warned that the ridge was steep on both sides, and that sometimes the wind picked up without warning. The guy who wrote it seemed experienced. He didn't talk it up too much, but he said if you were careful, it gave great views and solitude. That's what I wanted. I was tired of paved paths with benches and signs every quarter mile. I wanted quiet. I drove out early and parked off a gravel road that had long weeds growing over most of it. The area was forested, thick with tall pine and birch. The trailhead wasn't marked, just a slight dip off the road with a gap in the trees and a few stones someone had stacked to mark the start. It felt like I was stepping into something I wasn't supposed to find. I adjusted my pack, locked the car, and started walking in. The first couple miles were easy. The path was narrow and uneven but visible. Fallen leaves blanketed the ground in shades of yellow, orange, and brown. The air smelled like dry bark and pine sap. Birds chirped far above me, but otherwise, it was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing I noticed after a while. No wind.
No rustling.
Just the soft crunch of my boots. It felt like I had walked into a room where someone had turned off all the sound. But I kept going. I stopped around mid-morning at a small clearing where the sun peeked through the trees. I ate a bar, took a few sips of water, and kept walking. The incline started picking up. The trail thinned out. At times, I could barely tell where it went, but I'd find a broken branch or a boot mark and keep going. There were no signs of other hikers, no wrappers, no carved initials, not even the sound of a plane above. By noon, I had reached the start of the ridgeline. The trees thinned out, and I could finally see sky stretching wide around me. The view really was something. The ridge dropped off hard on both sides, maybe 100 feet or more in some places, and ran along the spine of a hill like a backbone. I could see forest for miles, untouched, a green sea below me. The wind picked up here just like the blog had said. I tightened the straps on my jacket and made sure my footing was steady. The trail along the ridge was narrow, sometimes just a couple feet wide. One wrong step and you'd be tumbling down. I kept my eyes on the ground and took it slow. I wasn't in a rush. I planned to hike the ridge and make a loop back around by early evening. There was plenty of daylight. The ridge kept rising. The higher I went, the more the air felt thinner, cooler. The wind gusts weren't constant but came in sharp bursts. At one point, I had to crouch down to keep my balance. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist a little. There were drag marks on the trail, thin, long, like something had been pulled. I don't know why it bothered me, but it didn't look natural. It wasn't like an animal trail or a branch that had fallen. It looked recent. I kept going. There wasn't anywhere to turn back safely. On both sides, the ridge sloped down into thick forest. I figured I'd keep moving until the trail widened again. The drag marks faded after another few yards, and I told myself it was nothing. I hiked for another hour without stopping. The sun had shifted by now, hanging lower in the sky. That's when I reached the part that didn't match the blog's description. According to the post, after about 5 miles along the ridge, the trail curved down into a forested bowl and rejoined a wider path. But what I saw ahead didn't match that. The trail suddenly dropped steeply, not into a bowl, but down a rocky slope that looked unstable. There was no sign of a fork, no cairns or markers, nothing that told me this was the way out. I checked my GPS, but there was no signal, just a spinning icon. I even checked a downloaded offline map, but it didn't show this ridge at all. I stood there for a long while, staring at the drop ahead. The sun was sliding behind the trees now, and the air was colder. I decided to try the descent. It looked steep but passable. I crouched slightly, leaned into the slope, and began climbing down, planting my boots carefully and using exposed roots and rocks as grips. It was slow, and every shift of dirt made my heart jump. Halfway down, one of the rocks I grabbed gave way. It broke off in my hand, and I fell forward hard. My right knee slammed against a flat stone, and pain shot through my leg. I let out a grunt and slid a couple feet before stopping myself. My hands were scraped. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, my knee throbbing. I checked it. It wasn't broken, but it felt bruised deep. I got up slowly and kept going, favoring the good leg. I made it to the bottom just as the last light faded. Now I was in thick woods again, and it was almost dark. I pulled out my flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the trees, but it wasn't strong. I wished I had brought my headlamp too. There was no trail at the bottom, just woods, dense and silent. I turned slowly, trying to find a direction, any slope or break in the trees, but it all looked the same. The worst part was the feeling, like I had stepped into something wrong. Not supernatural, just wrong, like a place no one had touched for a long time. The air smelled different, wet and metallic. I decided to move east, keeping my compass steady. I figured I'd hit another trail or a stream or anything I could follow. The woods were tighter here. Branches clawed at my jacket. My boots sank into damp soil. The ground was uneven. Every few steps I thought I heard something behind me, but when I stopped, there was only silence. No birds, no wind, not even my own breath after a while. That's when I knew I was lost. Completely. I found a small rise and climbed it, hoping to get some kind of vantage. At the top, I saw something that froze me in place. There was a tarp, faded blue, half buried in dirt and leaves. It was stretched between two trees but falling apart. Beneath it, a collapsed sleeping bag and what looked like a metal cup. I approached slowly. Everything looked old, weathered by time. No sign of anyone, just the remains of a camp that hadn't been touched in years. I looked around carefully. There were scraps of food wrappers, a rusted can, a small notebook swollen with moisture. I picked it up. Most of the pages were smeared, unreadable, but one line stood out on a dry page in the middle. Asterisk, can't find the ridge again. Going south. If someone finds this, I was here. Asterisk. That's when I realized someone else had been just as lost as I was. Maybe they never made it out. I moved fast after that, not running, but pushing through brush harder than I should have. My knees screamed with every step, but I didn't stop. I checked my compass every 10 steps, making sure I kept the direction. I drank the last of my water and kept moving. It was after midnight when I finally heard something besides my own steps, the soft trickle of water. I followed it and found a stream, small but steady. I used my filter and drank until my hands were numb. I figured following the stream downstream might lead me somewhere. People build near water, right? So I followed it. I walked all night, taking short rests, sometimes closing my eyes for a minute before forcing myself to get back up. The flashlight died just before dawn. I kept moving in the dim light. My knee was swelling now, and my hands ached. I hadn't eaten in hours. By noon the next day, I saw a structure through the trees. Not a house, just a hunting blind on stilts, old but intact. That meant someone came through here sometimes. I climbed up and found a small plastic container with a few things: emergency matches, an old radio with dead batteries, a knife, and a laminated map of hunting zones. That was my break. The map wasn't perfect, but it showed a fire road less than 2 miles east. I tore it from the wall and climbed back down. I followed the compass east, dragging my bad leg, scraping through the brush. Took me hours. I hit the road just before sunset. It was wide, dirt-packed with tire tracks. I followed it for another 3 miles until I saw the glint of metal. An old truck parked at a gate. Nobody was in it, but I waited. Eventually, A man on an ATV rolled up from a side trail. He stared at me like I was a ghost. He gave me a ride back to the main road. From there, I had been planning the solo trip for months. Work had been eating me alive for over a year, and my head felt like it was about to explode from all the noise. Every day, I was just bouncing between screens and emails and traffic and bills. I wanted to shut all of it out. No phone, no city sounds, just woods. I picked a trail in a national forest a few hours from where I lived. It was in the mountains, away from everything. The place had no cell signal, no facilities after the first few miles, and barely any foot traffic. That was exactly what I needed. I packed heavy, not because I didn't know what I was doing, but because I didn't want to risk needing anything. I brought my tent, a new sleeping bag, freeze-dried food for 6 days, my portable water filter, extra clothes, a battery pack for emergencies, a topographic map, a physical compass, and even backup batteries for my headlamp. I had a satellite SOS device too, clipped to the shoulder strap of my backpack. I thought I was smart. I thought I was safe. That's what I kept telling myself. I started early in the morning. It was still cold when I locked my car at the trailhead. There were only 2 other cars there, but I never saw anyone else the whole day. The trail was beautiful, narrow and winding, with thick trees hugging both sides. It climbed higher every hour, and by late afternoon I was several thousand feet above where I started. I made camp beside a small creek around 5 p.m. and cooked my food quietly, watching the trees rock in the breeze. I didn't hear anything unusual that night except a few snapping twigs and rustling leaves. But that's normal in the woods. Animals move around. The second day I hiked deeper. The ridge trail was steep, and it felt like no one had used this part of it for a long time. The ground was soft in places where the pine needles built up, but occasionally I hit long stretches of sharp rock where the trail barely clung to the slope. I had to be careful. One wrong step would send me tumbling down several hundred feet. I liked that. It made everything else feel far away. I camped higher up that night on a patch of flat earth behind a cluster of boulders. It was windy and colder, and I woke up a few times to branches creaking and howling air, but nothing strange. Still, something had shifted in how I felt. I didn't know what it was. I just felt heavier inside. Not scared exactly, just alert, like my body was on edge for some reason, but my brain couldn't figure out why. I figured it was just being out in the open and sleeping alone. By the 3rd morning, clouds were forming above the ridge. I was supposed to head to a higher point that day where the trail reached its highest elevation before circling down into the northern valleys. I almost turned back, but the sky didn't look too bad and I had good gear. The climb was tough. The trail thinned out until it felt more like a goat path along a knife edge. One side dropped into trees. The other side dropped straight into a rock chute. I had to stop a few times to check the map and catch my breath. That's when I saw something that I still can't fully explain. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just strange. About 200 yards ahead, the trail was blocked. I didn't see it clearly at first, but when I looked again, I realized the path was covered by a fresh rock slide. Not huge, but enough to make it dangerous to cross. What bothered me wasn't that the trail was blocked. It was how fresh it looked. The rocks were sharp and loose, as if they hadn't been there long. Some dust was still hanging in the air like it had just settled. I looked up the slope above the slide. It wasn't steep enough to collapse on its own. No storms, no animals, no recent weather changes. That's when my stomach dropped a little. I backed away and checked the map again. There was a possible alternate route that dropped down the side and curved around the ridge, but it wasn't an official trail. Just a faint game path marked on an old topo line. I stood there for a long time thinking about what to do. Eventually, I decided to try the side trail. I didn't want to risk crossing the rockfall. It was a mistake. That side path started easy enough. A narrow slope with scattered pine trees, soft moss underfoot, and loose stone here and there. I followed it for about an hour, constantly checking the map. But something was off. The path dropped lower than it should have, and soon I realized I'd veered off too far to the east. When I looked back up, I couldn't even see the main ridge anymore. Trees had swallowed everything behind me. I tried to backtrack, but the slope was too steep. It took me another 2 hours just to find a place flat enough to rest. I checked my GPS. The dot on the screen was floating somewhere off-trail. I still had supplies, but I had no idea where I was. I set up camp again, ate silently, and told myself I'd fix it in the morning. That night was different. I woke up to footsteps, not animals, not wind. These were heavier, human. I froze in my bag, barely breathing. The steps were slow and steady, crunching pine needles maybe 10 feet away. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. For the next hour, I stared out into the darkness from inside my tent, listening for anything else. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep from exhaustion. In the morning, I found boot prints. They circled my camp twice before heading down the hill. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I didn't want to believe it. I hadn't seen a single person in 3 days. No one should be here. No trails, no campsites, no cabins. Just trees and rocks. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a ranger. Maybe someone else got lost too. But the prints didn't look like ranger boots. Too worn. Old rubber soles, deeply indented. I packed faster than I ever had before and started walking. I didn't care where. I just needed to put distance between me and those prints. I tried to climb back toward the ridge but kept slipping on loose ground. The forest got thicker. Branches tore at my arms and face. My clothes were soaked with sweat. Hours passed. I started to panic a little. My compass still worked, but everything around me looked the same. Pines, rocks, ferns. No trail markers, no ridgelines. At some point, I found an old fire ring. Blackened stones in a circle, long cold. No trash, no signs of people, just that ring. I wasn't sure if it was a good sign or a bad one. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I found a narrow ravine that seemed to lead west. The map suggested it would connect to a creek, and that creek might follow back toward the main loop trail. I followed it down. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing something in the woods. Not close, but steady. Stayed far enough that I couldn't see it, but it didn't stop. Every time I moved, it moved. Every time I stopped, it stopped. I sat awake in my bag, headlamp off, bear spray in my hand. Hours passed that way. I didn't even notice when the sound stopped. My ears had just grown used to it. The next morning, I noticed something that scared me more than anything else so far. The side of my backpack was cut. Not torn, cut. A clean slice through the fabric of the outer pouch. I kept my backup knife there. It was gone. The strap wasn't broken. It was unclipped. Someone had been in my camp. While I slept, I broke down for a minute, sat there shaking, trying to breathe. My legs wouldn't stop trembling. I didn't want to stay another second. I loaded everything up and forced myself down the ravine. I stumbled a few times, bruised my knee on a rock, but kept going. Eventually, I reached water, a slow, cold stream winding through thick underbrush. I followed it west. For 2 days, I followed that stream. The forest never ended. The weather turned worse. Cold rain started falling in the afternoon and lasted through the night. My boots were soaked. My fingers cracked from the cold. I kept walking anyway. The idea of stopping made my skin crawl. I don't know how far I went. My battery pack died. The GPS was useless now. The map didn't show any of this. On the 5th day, I saw something that nearly made me collapse with relief. A trail marker, an old wooden post, cracked and mossy, with faint red paint peeling down the side. I didn't know what trail it was, but I followed it anyway. It climbed again, winding slowly toward the northern side of the mountain. The ground felt familiar. The air smelled less thick. I kept moving 1 foot after the other, barely able to hold my pack straight. Late that evening, I saw the first human structure in nearly a week. A trail shelter, a simple wooden lean-to with a tin roof and a bench inside. Empty, no one around, but it was dry and that was enough. I dropped my pack, crawled inside, and stayed awake the whole night, gripping the bear spray like it was the last thing keeping me alive. The next morning, I heard voices in the distance. Real voices, hikers. I didn't come out right away. I waited until I saw them. 2 women and a man with clean gear and happy faces. Day hikers. I stepped out slowly, looking like something pulled out of a cave. They looked shocked when they saw me. They took me with them, helped me back down the main trail to the ranger station. I left early that morning, sometime around 6:30 a.m. The sky was a dull blue with just a hint of gold on the horizon. I had packed my bag the night before: water, a few energy bars, a compass, a physical map, a flashlight, a knife, and a small first aid kit. My phone was fully charged, and I had an external battery pack with me too. I had done this hike before, but only once, and that time I was with 2 other people. This time I wanted to do it alone. I felt confident about the route. I remembered most of it and had the map just in case. The area was known as Black Ridge Loop, a backcountry trail in a remote part of the state forest. About 25 miles total. I planned to do about 15 miles the first day and finish the rest the next. The trailhead was empty when I parked my car. There were 2 other vehicles parked near the start, but no one around. I stretched, locked the car, and started walking into the trees. It was quiet, just the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the light rustling of wind in the trees. The forest was dense but not suffocating. There were tall pine trees, some thick maples, a few birch scattered throughout. Birds chirped high up. The ground had pine needles and dry leaves from the previous season. The first few miles were smooth. I kept a good pace, stopped occasionally to sip water, and took a few photos. I saw a fork in the trail around mile 6. I remembered the split from last time. The left trail was the main loop. The right one went up a ridge and met back with the main loop several miles later. Last time we'd gone left. This time I decided to try the ridge trail. I wanted a new view. I wasn't worried. The map showed that both trails connected again after about 4 or 5 miles. I turned right and started climbing. The trail was narrow, more overgrown than the main one. It zigzagged up a steep slope, and my legs started to burn. I liked that. It made me feel like I was earning something. After about an hour of climbing, I reached a high point where the trees opened up. I could see the hills rolling far into the distance, all covered in green. No signs of roads or houses, just trees. Felt peaceful. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, letting sweat drip from my forehead, looking around. I didn't see any trail markers, but I didn't worry. It seemed like a real trail, and the map showed it reconnected later. I kept going. The trail began to descend again, curving down the other side of the ridge. The slope was steeper, and I had to watch my footing. I saw fewer signs of foot traffic, no recent boot prints, no disturbed leaves. I stopped to check the map, but it wasn't very clear about this section. I used the compass and tried to keep heading southeast. The trail kept going, so I followed. Around mile 10, the trail started to vanish. First, it was just faint. Then it completely disappeared into underbrush. I stopped. I turned around, thinking maybe I had walked off it somehow. But looking back, I couldn't find where it had started fading. Everything looked the same: trees, bushes, shadows. I pulled out the map again and tried to orient myself. I figured I had to be somewhere in the middle section between the ridge and the main loop. If I kept going east or southeast, I'd hit the main trail again eventually. That's what I told myself. So I picked a direction based on the compass and kept moving. I was walking between trees now, not on a trail. The forest was thick. Branches scraped my clothes. I had to duck and push my way through some areas. After about an hour, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. The ground was uneven: slopes, gullies, fallen logs. I slipped several times. At one point, I slid down a muddy hill and tore a hole in my pants. My hands got scratched trying to catch myself on rough bark. I stopped and sat on a rock, breathing hard. I looked around. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees. That's when I started feeling something else. Not panic, not yet, but something inside me started to sink. I checked my phone. 1 bar of signal. I opened the GPS. It loaded slowly, then showed a blinking dot.
No trails.
No roads, just blank forest. The app glitched, then froze. I restarted it, but the signal was gone. 0 bars now. I waited. Still nothing. I kept moving. I told myself I just needed to hit the main trail again. I pushed through a dense patch of brush and came out near a dry creek bed. The rocks were mossy and smooth. I decided to follow it. Water usually meant direction. Maybe it would lead somewhere. I followed the rocky bed for almost an hour, but it curved and forked so many times I couldn't tell if it was helping or not. I hadn't seen any trail markers in hours. I hadn't seen a boot print, a broken twig, or any human sign. It was around 3 p.m. when I finally admitted I was lost. I sat down again, ate a bar, drank some water. I had about 1.5 liters left. Not enough if I had to spend the night. I looked at the trees, hoping I'd see something man-made, even a ribbon or a broken signpost. Nothing. I kept walking, slowly now. Every direction I chose felt random. I didn't know if I was looping or not. The shadows started getting longer. The sun wasn't setting yet, but I could feel it getting lower. I knew I had maybe 3 or 4 hours of daylight left. By 5:30, I still hadn't found anything. That's when panic started coming in. My mouth was dry. My hands were scratched and dirty. I had burrs stuck to my socks and my shoulders ached. I finally stopped walking and made a small clearing near a big tree. I didn't want to walk into the dark and twist my ankle or fall into a ditch. I found some dry leaves and cleared out a space. I sat down and leaned back against the tree. The forest got quiet, really quiet. No birds, no wind, no bugs, just the sound of my own breathing. I thought about using the flashlight, but I decided to save the battery. I still had some food and water. I used my jacket as a pillow and tried to rest. I didn't really sleep, just closed my eyes and drifted in and out. In the night, I heard something. It was soft at first, just crunching. Then it stopped. Then again, closer. I sat up, heart racing. I couldn't see anything in the dark. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. The crunching stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I got up stiff and cold. I drank some water, chewed half a bar, and started walking again. I followed the slope of the land, hoping to go downhill. Maybe I'd find a road, a river, something. Around 10 a.m., I started hearing something. A sound that didn't belong in the forest. A faint hum. I stopped and listened. Faded, then came back stronger. I followed it. It got louder. Eventually, I saw it, a power line. Thick wires running above a cleared path. I stood there, breathing heavy, smiling. It was the first man-made thing I'd seen in almost 24 hours. I followed the power line path. It wasn't a real trail, but the ground was clear enough to walk. After another hour, I saw something else, fence posts. Then, in the distance, the roof of a cabin. I walked straight to it. It looked old. No car.
No smoke.
Windows boarded up. But it was something. I knocked anyway. No answer. I walked around. The door was unlocked. Inside, it was dusty and smelled like mold. But I found an old metal chair and sat down. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. I figured I'd stay near the cabin and follow the power lines again if nothing changed. I ate the last of my food. My water was almost gone. I thought about boiling some with a fire, but I had no pot or way to carry it. I rested, then walked a few hundred feet up the path to get a better signal. Finally, a single bar. I climbed a tree halfway and held the phone up. Signal bounced in. I called 911. The call dropped once. I called again and finally got through. I gave them what little I knew. Old cabin, power lines, somewhere east of Blackridge Loop. The dispatcher said they'd send someone and to stay put. I waited hours. I kept going back up the slope to check signal. I stayed in the cabin, sitting by the door. Around 4 p.m., I heard voices, men shouting. I stepped outside and waved. 2 guys in forest ranger uniforms came walking up. I almost collapsed with relief. They gave me water and a granola bar. They led me to a dirt road about a mile away. There was a truck waiting. They said the cabin was an old fire watch station abandoned years ago. Not on most maps anymore. I had gone almost 9 miles off trail. They drove me back to the ranger station and took my info. I called a friend to pick me up and went home the same night. The whole thing shook me up for weeks. I kept thinking about how close I had come to being stuck out there for days, or worse, if I hadn't found those power lines, or if the signal hadn't come through just enough, I might still be wandering those woods. It made me realize how fast things can go wrong, even when you think you're prepared. Now I triple-check my route. I started the day like I usually did before any hike. Woke up early, ate a simple breakfast, double-checked my backpack, filled my water bottles, and packed enough food for the trip. I wasn't doing anything extreme that day. It was supposed to be a 2-day solo hike through a less traveled route in a forested mountain region that bordered an older national park. I had read about the trail on a hiking forum. It wasn't part of the main tourist paths, which was exactly why I chose it. I wanted peace and quiet, just me and nature. The area was about a 3-hour drive from my home. I parked my car near a small rest stop where the trail began. The air was clean and cool when I stepped out. It had rained 2 days before, so the smell of damp earth and pine needles was strong. The sky was mostly clear, just a few clouds drifting above the trees. Everything felt calm. I locked my car, threw the straps of my backpack over my shoulders, and walked into the woods. The path was narrow but well-defined. It wound between tall pine trees and ran alongside a shallow stream for the first couple of miles. Birds chirped above me, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. I stopped every now and then to take pictures, mostly of moss-covered rocks, wildflowers, and tree trunks split by lightning. I liked small details like that. They told stories without needing words. By midday, I was a good 5 miles in. I stopped by the stream, ate a sandwich, and took a few sips from my bottle. I checked the map I had printed, which matched what I had stored on my phone. I didn't have cell signal anymore, but I had saved everything offline. The trail curved up into the hills, and about 6 miles from that point, it was supposed to open into a small, flat area by an old fire watchtower that had been abandoned. That's where I planned to set up camp for the night. The trail after lunch was steeper, and the ground was still soft from the earlier rains. My boots sank slightly into the dirt with each step, and I had to move more slowly. I was sweating a lot more now, and bugs were starting to buzz around me, especially near the thicker parts of the trail where the trees leaned closer together and blocked out the sun. Somewhere around mile 7, I noticed something I should have paid more attention to at the time. There was a small landslide just a few feet wide, where part of the trail had crumbled downhill. It looked recent. The soil was loose and wet, the rocks freshly exposed. I had to step carefully across it, keeping my weight low and holding onto a branch for balance. My boots slid slightly, but I made it over without falling. I told myself it was no big deal and kept going. The trees got denser after that. I had to duck under fallen trunks and climb over large rocks covered in moss. I started to feel that familiar sense of being completely alone. No sounds of other hikers, no voices, just the wind moving through branches and the occasional crack of a twig. It was peaceful but also slightly unnerving. I liked hiking alone, but it always brought a certain pressure with it. You knew that if something went wrong, you only had yourself. Around 5 p.m., I finally reached the open flat area near the fire watchtower. The tower itself was old and rusted, the stairs partially collapsed. It had a square base made of thick metal beams, most of which were covered in graffiti. A few rotting planks of wood leaned against one side, probably left by someone else who had camped here before. I found a decent spot to pitch my small tent, dry, level ground near a few tall trees that could offer some wind cover. I set up the tent, unrolled my sleeping pad and bag, and boiled some water to make instant noodles. As I ate, the temperature began to drop. The sky had turned pale orange as the sun dipped below the hills. I cleaned up my trash, packed everything into a bag, and tied it high in a tree to keep animals away. After that, I sat for a while just listening. There was something about the quiet that started to feel different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was too quiet, no birds, no insects, no wind. But I ignored it. I told myself I was just tired. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and laid back on the sleeping pad. I set my watch alarm for 7 a.m., turned off my flashlight, and closed my eyes. I woke up once in the night to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening, but it didn't come again. After a few minutes, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the area. Nothing looked disturbed. The bag of food was still hanging where I had left it. I made a quick breakfast, packed everything up, and decided I'd hike out by taking a longer loop that circled around the East Ridge. It would add about 3 miles to my return trip, but would offer some different views, including a deep ravine that was supposed to be beautiful this time of year. I started hiking around 8 a.m. The new trail was rougher, less used, and more overgrown. At some points, I had to push through thick bushes or climb over fallen logs that hadn't been cleared in years. I could tell not many people used this side of the mountain. The air felt heavy, and even though the sun was out, it was darker under the trees. About 2 hours in, I came across another sign of something off. A tree had fallen directly across the trail, snapped at the base like it had been hit by something massive. The cut wasn't clean like a chainsaw. It looked splintered and rough. There were drag marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been pulled across it. I stood there for a long minute trying to figure out what could have done that. Maybe a storm? Maybe strong wind? But the rest of the trees looked fine. Still, I stepped over the fallen trunk and kept going. As I got deeper into the ridge, the trail began to narrow. On my right side, the land sloped steeply down into the ravine. On the left was a rocky wall covered in moss and roots. I had to stay close to the wall for balance. One wrong step could send me sliding down the hillside. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bird call. It was a loud snapping noise, like thick branches being broken. Not just one or two, but a series of them, cracking and falling in quick bursts. I stopped walking and looked around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Then it happened again, this time louder and closer. I stayed completely still. It was coming from down the slope, maybe 30 or 40 feet below. I couldn't see anything because of the thick brush, but I could hear something moving. Heavy steps, snapping twigs, dry leaves rustling under weight. It didn't sound like a deer or a bear. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded bigger, slower, purposeful. I backed up a few steps, trying not to make noise. My heart was beating so hard it was all I could hear in my ears. I crouched near the wall, half hiding behind a rock outcrop, and waited. Then, for almost 10 minutes, there was nothing. Just silence again. I decided to move. Slowly, carefully, I started forward again. The trail twisted and narrowed even more until it reached a small clearing where the trees thinned and sunlight came through. I stopped to catch my breath. I looked back down the trail behind me. Still nothing. But then I noticed something ahead, about 15 feet away, off the path. It looked like a boot. I stepped closer. It was a hiking boot, sitting at an odd angle, half buried under leaves. I bent down and pulled it free. It was old, worn, and had dry mud on the sides, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. It was cracked, but not falling apart. I looked around and saw something else, what looked like a torn piece of cloth caught on a branch, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I didn't know what to make of it. Then I saw the scratches. Long, deep gouges in the tree trunks, about chest high, running parallel in straight lines like claw marks. They weren't made by a knife or an axe. The spacing was uneven, and the bark was torn rather than sliced. I turned around. I didn't want to keep going through this loop anymore. I decided to head back the way I came, even if it took longer. I didn't want to find out what had made those marks. As I turned, I saw something move just a flicker off in the trees to the side. I froze again. It was too far to see clearly, but I could tell something was standing there, just beyond the thicker trees. Not a person. Not exactly. I couldn't explain it. It was big, too big to be a deer. And it wasn't running. It was just standing, watching. I backed away step by step, never turning my back. Then I heard the noise again, those branches snapping, heavier this time. Whatever it was coming up the hill. I turned and started walking fast, then running. My pack bounced on my back, and I almost tripped over a root. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. The trail was harder going back. I slipped twice on loose gravel, scraped my hand on a rock, and tore my sleeve on a branch. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept going. It took me 3 hours to reach the place where the small landslide had been. But something had changed. The trail was worse now. More of the hillside had fallen, and the soil was loose and wet. The crossing was wider, more dangerous. I tested the edge with my foot, and the ground gave way. I had no choice but to try anyway. I took one. Started out as something simple. I had just needed a break from everything. Work had been eating me alive for months. I felt like a piece of machinery, something just built to produce and never stop. I barely slept right, didn't eat well, and the city noise made it impossible to think. So when I saw a small hiking cabin listed for cheap on a backcountry rental site, I booked it without thinking twice. It sat near a long trail system that wove deep into a remote forest in the northern part of the state. The reviews were limited, but the few that existed called it peaceful, quiet, and perfect for clearing your head. I packed light, just a 60-liter backpack, some basic gear, tent, knife, cooking tools, energy bars, freeze-dried meals, water bottles, purification tablets, rain gear, a headlamp with extra batteries, and a solar charger. I also brought my phone, even though I expected there wouldn't be any signal where I was going. The cabin wasn't a full-time residence, just a tiny wooden shelter with no electricity, no running water, and a wood-burning stove. It sat at the edge of the forest, with trails stretching out in every direction. A small river ran nearby. It looked perfect. I drove up on a Thursday early morning trying to beat the weekend hikers. The trailhead was empty when I arrived, and that gave me a little sense of comfort. I liked being alone. I always had. Solitude wasn't scary to me. It was relief. The first few hours of hiking were smooth. The weather was just cloudy enough to keep the sun off me, and the air smelled like pine needles and dirt. The trail wasn't marked very well, but I had a printed topographic map and a GPS watch I kept checking to make sure I was going the right way. It took me about 3.5 hours to reach the cabin, which sat tucked into a clearing surrounded by thick trees. It was nothing fancy, just a single room with a cot, a table, and a small wood stove in the corner. I threw my bag down, opened all the windows to air it out, and started collecting wood for the stove even though it was still warm out. I always liked to have things ready in case the weather turned. That first night went by peacefully. I cooked one of my freeze-dried meals, boiled some water for tea, and laid on the cot listening to the wind in the trees. There was no signal on my phone, but I expected that. I had turned it off to save battery anyway. Around midnight it started raining, soft at first, then heavy. It pattered against the wooden roof and made the forest sound alive. I fell asleep easily and didn't wake up until sunrise. The next morning, I decided to take a day hike. Nothing too far, just a loop trail that went around a small lake according to the map. It was supposed to be about 9 miles, a good hike but not too rough. I packed light, just a day bag, some water, snacks, my knife, my compass, and the map. I had my GPS watch too, though I'd only had it for a few months and still didn't trust it completely. It was cloudy again, and the rain had made the ground soft. The trail was muddy, and some of the markings were hard to see. About 2 hours in, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on the map. One path looked newer with fresh boot prints. The other was overgrown, like no one had walked it in years. I hesitated. My instincts told me to stick with the more worn trail. It usually meant people had used it recently, but the map said to go the other way. I stood there for a few minutes trying to decide. In the end, I went down the worn path, figuring it would rejoin the main trail later. That was the first mistake. After about 30 minutes, the trail started narrowing, almost like it wasn't a trail at all but just space between trees where others had walked. It sloped slightly downward, and soon I found myself in a denser part of the forest. The trees here were older and closer together. The ground was soft with thick moss, and everything smelled stronger. Damp earth, mold, pine. I noticed that the birds had stopped chirping. I kept walking, thinking I'd soon loop back to the lake trail. But after another hour, the trail disappeared completely. It just faded into the undergrowth. I stopped and looked around, thinking maybe I'd lost it, but there were no markers, no footprints, no signs of people. I took out my map, tried to line it up with my compass, but it didn't make sense. My GPS watch was still tracking me, but it wasn't showing any trail nearby. I should have turned back, but something pushed me forward. Maybe pride, or that stubborn voice that tells you, just keep going, you'll figure it out. So I kept walking. Another hour went by, then two. Soon I realized I wasn't just off trail. I was completely lost. Nothing around me looked familiar. There were no signs of water, no landmarks, nothing that matched the map. It was just trees, trees, more trees. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened and a fog started rolling in. The temperature dropped fast. I stopped and tried to check my phone, but there was still no signal. I turned it back off. I knew I had to stop and make shelter before it got too dark. I found a small dip in the land near some thick bushes, where the wind wouldn't hit me too hard. I used a tarp I kept in my day bag to create a lean-to shelter, piled leaves underneath it for insulation, and started a fire using some dried wood I found under a fallen log. I had waterproof matches and a backup lighter. I boiled some water with a metal cup I always carried and ate a few energy bars. That night was long. I barely slept. Every small sound in the woods made me flinch. I didn't feel like I was alone. I didn't hear animals. I didn't hear birds or wind, just this silence that pressed in from all sides. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard a sound. It was soft but clear, a stick snapping. Not just any stick, but the sound of something stepping on it. My heart started racing. I sat up, knife in hand, eyes wide open. I turned off my headlamp to keep from giving away my position. I listened, more silence, then another step, closer. I couldn't see anything through the trees. The fog had thickened, and the fire had burned down low. I grabbed a burning stick and stood with my back to the shelter, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but I felt it. Something was nearby. Something was watching me. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for sunrise. When it finally came, I packed up fast and started walking in the direction I thought the cabin was. I didn't have much water left, but I figured if I found the river near the cabin, I'd be able to follow it back. The problem was, I couldn't find the river, and after a few hours, my GPS watch died. I hadn't brought the solar charger with me. It was back at the cabin. By noon, I stumbled onto something strange. It was an old camp, not mine, someone else's, and it didn't look like it had been abandoned long. There was a rusted metal pot hanging from a blackened fire ring. A blue tarp was stretched between two trees, rotting and sagging. Underneath it, I found a broken backpack, moldy clothing, and a torn sleeping bag. There were carvings on a tree nearby, just slashes over and over, deep cuts into the bark. Not words, just marks, dozens of them. I felt cold all over. I searched the camp for anything useful. I found an old bottle with water in it, but it was green and slimy. I didn't drink it. I found a small knife, dull but better than nothing. No food, no map, no signs of a person. Just that feeling again that someone was watching. I moved on fast after that, heading in what I hoped was west. My feet were soaked. My hands were scraped raw. My head ached from not drinking enough. Around mid-afternoon, I started hearing things again. Soft footsteps, too soft to be a large animal. Branches cracking far behind me. I'd stop and the sound would stop too. Then it would start again when I walked. It went like that for hours. Stop, listen, move. Stop, listen, move. I started to feel paranoid. My thoughts turned sharp and panicked. I kept looking over my shoulder. At one point, I swore I saw a figure behind a tree. Not close, but not far. Just a dark shape. But when I moved toward it, it was gone. By sunset, I found a tree with a thick hollow at the base and decided to sleep inside it. I covered the entrance with branches. I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to be seen. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I heard footsteps again, even closer. Not running, not fast. Just slow, steady, careful. Like someone circling. I stayed absolutely still, my knife in hand, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't make noise. At one point, I heard breathing outside the tree. Shallow, close. Then it was gone. I stayed in that tree until full daylight. On the third day, I decided to stop walking randomly and climb a tree to try to get a better view. It took me a while, but I found a tall pine and pulled myself up, branch by branch, until I was about 30 feet off the ground. From there, I could see the river in the distance. It was far, maybe 2 or 3 miles, but it gave me a target. I climbed down and started moving toward it. Took most of the day. I was tired, dizzy, and nearly collapsed when I finally reached the river. I drank from it, filtered what I could with my water bottle, and rested for a while. I decided to go hiking alone that weekend. I had a few days off work, and I just needed to get away from everything. I had been feeling worn out. The stress, the constant noise, the people, the tight schedule, I was fed up. I wanted peace. So I packed my hiking gear, some dried food, a camping stove, a small tent, my sleeping bag, a decent knife, my flashlight, and enough water to last me a couple of days. I also packed my battery bank and made sure my phone was fully charged, just in case. I was going into a part of the forested hills I hadn't explored before. It was one of those trails that didn't get many hikers. Steep, remote, not tourist-friendly. That was what I liked about it. It took me about 4 hours to drive out to the area. The road was rough near the end, lots of potholes and turns, and almost no cell reception. There were no shops nearby, no houses, no signs. I parked my car near the base of the trail, far away from anything else. The air was quiet. I looked around before I set off, and I remember how alone I felt already. I liked that. It made me feel like the world had gone silent for me. That was what I wanted. The first couple of hours were peaceful. I moved slowly through a narrow dirt path that wound up through thick woods. The trees were close together, tall and wide, old-looking, with dark trunks and high branches. There were lots of ferns growing around the base, and the ground was uneven, rocks, roots, sometimes small slopes I had to climb over with my hands. It wasn't a clean trail. It had probably once been a proper hiking route, but it hadn't been maintained for years. I didn't see anyone the whole time. I liked that, but by the time I reached a small clearing, I was tired. I checked my GPS and marked my location. I had made it about 8 miles up the side of the hill. From here, the trail would get even steeper and less clear. I decided to set up camp for the night. The clearing was a flat patch of grass with a few logs on the side. It looked like someone might have camped there before a long time ago. There were burnt logs arranged in a circle, but they were wet and rotten now. I cleared some space, pitched my tent, and made myself a quick meal with the stove. I boiled some water for instant noodles and ate while sitting on one of the old logs, just looking at the woods in front of me. The sun dipped low behind the trees. It started getting cold quickly. I zipped myself into the tent after brushing my teeth with some water from my bottle. I had a thin ground mat to lie on and a decent sleeping bag. I turned off my flashlight, set my phone to airplane mode, and just lay there listening to the wind in the trees. That first night was quiet, at least at first. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. I don't know why. It wasn't a sound, exactly. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was just my body reacting to the isolation. I opened my eyes in the dark, and for a second, I just listened. Nothing. Just wind again. Maybe a branch creaking far away. But something felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but it felt like I wasn't as alone anymore. That feeling sat in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just a natural reaction to being deep in the woods alone. I forced myself to close my eyes again and drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the sky was gray. Not raining, but cloudy enough to keep the lights soft and dim. I made coffee from my small pack, heated it up, and ate a protein bar. I looked around the clearing before packing up, and that was when I saw something strange. There was a small broken branch near the edge of the clearing. It was fresh, green inside, snapped clean. It hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of that. I don't miss things like that. The edge of the clearing also looked disturbed. The grass had been pressed down as if someone had stepped through it. Maybe more than once. Could have been a deer, I thought. Or a bear. Maybe even a big cat. But that still didn't sit right with me. There were no tracks, just flattened spots. and the way they curved around the clearing didn't look like an animal passing through in a straight line. It looked more like something circling. Slowly, I packed up and got moving again. I didn't want to stay too long in one spot. I kept telling myself it was just a deer, or that maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I also found myself checking over my shoulder more than I had the day before. The trail was even harder now. Narrow, sometimes fading into nothing but patches of dirt and rock. I had to use my hands to climb over thick roots and slide down some short drops. The higher I went, the denser the woods seemed to get. Fewer birds, less light, just trees that stood tall and still like walls closing in. Around midday, I took a break near a fallen tree. I was sitting there, wiping sweat off my face, when I noticed something stuck between two rocks just behind the tree. It was a piece of cloth, torn, dark green like part of a jacket. I picked it up. It was dirty, old, but not rotten. Looked like it had been out here a few weeks, maybe less. I looked around. No other sign of anyone.
No backpack, no trash, no gear.
Just that piece of cloth. I put it back where I found it. I didn't want to carry someone else's problem, but it stayed in my head. Later that afternoon, I was walking along a narrow ridge. The drop on one side was steep, covered in trees too deep to see the bottom. That's when I saw something else that stopped me in my tracks. Up ahead on the path was a footprint. Human, not mine. The dirt was soft enough from recent rain to hold the shape. A single boot print, facing the same direction I was going. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little bigger. I bent down and looked closely. It was fresh, too fresh, probably just hours ahead of me. That made me stop. I stood there and listened. Nothing but wind again.
No voices, no crackling twigs.
Just that thick silence that wraps around you out here. But now my chest felt tight. If someone else was ahead of me on this isolated trail, who were they? This wasn't the kind of place people came to for fun, and I hadn't seen a single car or hiker the whole way in. Still, I kept going, but slower now. I scanning, ears tuned to every sound. I made camp again that night on a small flat spot tucked behind a ring of bushes. It wasn't much, just enough space to sleep. I picked it because it was hidden. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't light a fire, just ate cold food and drank from my bottle. I sat with my back against a rock, my flashlight turned off, just watching the trail in the dark. That night, I barely slept. And sometime after midnight, I heard something. It started soft, leaves crunching, maybe 50 feet away. Then the sound of a twig snapping. Then silence. Then another step. Then nothing again. I held my breath. My knife was in my hand, gripped so tight my knuckles hurt. I didn't move. I just listened. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum. Whoever it was, they stopped just past the bushes. They didn't come closer. And after a while, the sounds faded. I stayed awake until the sky began to brighten. In the morning, I found something that chilled me worse than the night air ever could. About 20 feet from my tent, placed carefully on a flat rock, was a small piece of jerky. Not mine. I hadn't eaten jerky. I had protein bars and dehydrated meals. It had been placed there on purpose. I left the camp immediately. I didn't bother folding my tent properly. I stuffed it into my bag and started back down the trail. But I took a different path. There was an older trail I remembered seeing on the map, one that looped back toward the valley but was harder to follow. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. That whole day, I moved fast. My feet were sore and my legs burned, but I didn't stop much. The woods felt wrong. I kept hearing things behind me. Soft steps, rocks shifting, branches snapping. I never saw anything, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Once, I heard something whistle far off to my left, just 2 short notes, like a signal. But when I froze and listened, there was nothing else. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. When the sun began to set again, I was still too far from my car. I knew I had at least 6 or 7 more miles to go. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. My legs were giving out. I set up camp for one last night, this time near a big fallen log off trail. I dug a small trench around my tent to keep dry in case it rained, ate quickly, and kept my knife under my sleeping bag. That night, I didn't sleep at all, because that night I saw something. It was past midnight again when I noticed movement outside my tent. A shape, just a dark silhouette. I froze. My flashlight was in my bag. I didn't move a muscle. The figure stood there for a long time. Then, it slowly walked past my tent, not making a sound. I watched it through the thin fabric, tall, upright, slow steps. It paused near the log, then turned and vanished into the woods. I didn't sleep a second after that. When the sun finally came up, I was already packed. I started walking before the light had fully reached the forest floor. My legs were heavy, but I put It started like any other hike. I wasn't trying to do anything special that day. I had taken some time off work and wanted to clear my head. I didn't want to be around anyone. I wanted silence, trees, dirt under my boots, and the kind of tired you only get after a long day on the trail. I wasn't looking for any deep meaning or peace or whatever. I just wanted to be alone. So I chose a remote trail I'd read about in an old hiking forum. Something off the beaten path, barely maintained, but still marked on older topo maps. It was in a quiet area of forest near the base of a mountain range I hadn't explored much. There were no campgrounds nearby, no cell service, no regular patrols or tourist traffic. I didn't care about that. I had a printed map, a compass, a GPS watch, and a decent pack with enough food and water to last me 2 days if needed. I told one person, a friend who didn't really pay attention to the details, and then I left early that morning. The start of the trail was barely visible. It cut through some overgrown brush and then bent around the side of a hill. The trees were thick. The canopy blocked out most of the sun, and even though it was summer, the air under the trees felt damp and cold. I could hear birds and the distant sound of wind moving through branches. Everything smelled like moss and pine. It felt like I had stepped into a place forgotten by people, which I liked. That was the point. For the first couple hours, the trail climbed slowly. I passed an old trail marker nailed to a tree that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The paint was peeling, and the edges were rusted. I kept walking. The path got narrow in places and crossed through sections of loose rock, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I had my boots laced tight, a walking stick I always carried, and plenty of daylight ahead of me. Around noon, I stopped near a small stream to eat something. I sat on a flat rock and listened to the water moving over stones. It was peaceful. I refilled my bottle from the stream using a filter and checked my map. According to the contour lines, the trail would keep going uphill for another couple miles before leveling out along a ridge. That's where I planned to camp for the night. There was supposed to be a clearing there with a good view of the valley below. I kept walking. The forest changed as I climbed. The trees got taller, older, and the trail grew harder to follow. In some places, it disappeared completely under fallen leaves and needles. I started checking my compass more often and using landmarks, rock formations, strange stumps, bends in the stream to make sure I was on track. I had to slow down a lot, but I wasn't worried yet. Around 3 p.m., I hit the ridge. It felt good to be on level ground again, even though my legs were sore. The trail widened slightly, and for a while it followed the edge of a steep drop-off. I could finally see the valley below through breaks in the trees. It was mostly forest, with a few open patches of rock and some thin blue lines that looked like rivers or streams. I remember standing there thinking it looked like something out of a painting. That's when things started to go wrong. I didn't hear anything weird. No growl, no snap of a branch, no sign of anything. I was just walking, checking my footing on a slope of loose dirt, when my right boot slipped. I wasn't moving fast, but the ground gave way quickly. My weight shifted forward, and I tried to stop myself with the walking stick, but it bent and cracked. I fell hard on my side, slid a few feet down the slope, and hit a rock with my shoulder. The pain shot straight through my arm. It wasn't a clean break, but it hurt bad enough that I knew something was wrong. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing hard, trying not to throw up. I moved my fingers, flexed my elbow. I could still move everything, but the pain was sharp and deep. It felt like something inside had been twisted or torn. I climbed back up the slope slowly. Every movement hurt, I was shaking by the time I reached the trail again. I sat down, drank some water, and looked at the ridge ahead. The sun had dropped lower in the sky than I'd realized. I checked my watch. It was almost 5 p.m. I was still a mile or so from the clearing, but now I was hurt and losing light. I made the decision to stop early. I found a flat area off the trail surrounded by dense trees and started setting up my bivy sack. Every motion with my right arm hurt like hell, but I got through it. I ate a little food, forced myself to drink, and laid down as the woods grew dark around me. The pain kept me awake most of the night. I couldn't find a good position to sleep, and every time I moved, I woke up again. In the early hours of the morning, I started hearing movement. At first I thought it was wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded heavier, more like something walking, stopping, then walking again. I couldn't see anything, and I didn't want to move. I stayed perfectly still in my sleeping bag, breathing through my nose, trying to be silent. The footsteps came and went. Sometimes they were close, sometimes far. At one point, I heard something crack like a branch snapping under weight. It wasn't an animal sound, it wasn't fast or skittering. It sounded like a person moving through the woods slowly, but I knew that didn't make sense. Nobody was out here. The trail wasn't even on most maps anymore. I didn't sleep again after that. When morning came, I packed up quickly. My arm was worse. The muscles around my shoulder were swollen, and every time I moved, I felt a deep pull inside, like the tissue was tearing. I knew I couldn't make it to the clearing. I had to go back. That's when I realized something else. The trail behind me was gone. Not just covered, gone. I walked back the way I had come, carefully, slowly, but the path didn't look the same. The trees were too close together and the slope was wrong. I couldn't find the landmarks I'd used on the way up. No rock formation, no weird stump. The forest had closed in. I took out the compass, oriented myself, and tried to head southwest, the same direction I had come from. For a while, it felt okay. Then I reached a stretch of brush I didn't remember. Thick, tangled branches that forced me to duck and squeeze through. I pushed forward, hoping to hit the stream again or some other sign I was on the right path. Instead, I ended up in a shallow ravine. It was filled with loose rocks and fallen trees, and it was steep on both sides. I had to climb up the far edge with one arm and my knees, which shredded my pants and cut my hands. I was bleeding, sore, and getting more and more panicked with every step. I checked my watch again. It was past noon, but the sky above the trees still looked gray. By mid-afternoon, I was lost, fully lost. I stopped trying to find the trail and focused on direction. I kept heading southwest, trusting the compass. My water was almost gone. I hadn't eaten anything since the morning before. I felt weak and dizzy, and my shoulder was swelling up badly. I started to see signs of old logging, stumps, rusted cans, broken boards. It gave me hope. I figured there had to be a road or access trail nearby. I followed the signs downhill for what felt like hours. My legs started to cramp. My skin felt too hot, like I had a fever. My thoughts got weird. I'd stop and stare at tree bark for minutes without knowing why. Around sunset, I found a cabin. It was small and half collapsed. The roof had caved in, and the door hung open on one hinge. I looked inside. There was a broken cot, some rotting cans, and an old metal stove with a hole in the side. I didn't care. It was shelter. I crawled inside and sat against the wall. I didn't even try to eat. I just drank the last of my water and closed my eyes. It was cold that night. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing sounds outside. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move past the doorway. I told myself it was my brain playing tricks on me. I had no choice but to stay there until morning. When daylight came, I checked the compass again. I started walking west, hoping to find some road or sign of people. My legs barely worked. I kept falling. I was out of water, soaked in sweat, shaking from cold and exhaustion. Midday, I heard something, a distant sound of an engine. I scrambled toward it. I tripped, fell, got back up, and kept going. Eventually, I broke out of the trees and stumbled onto a dirt road. A real road. I collapsed onto the gravel. Maybe 20 minutes later, A Forest Service truck came around the bend. The guy driving it saw me, stopped, jumped out, and ran over. I don't remember much after that. I know he radioed for help. I know they gave me water, checked my pulse, and got me into a clinic. I had a torn rotator cuff and severe dehydration. I spent 3 days in a hospital recovering. The Forest Service said the trail I used hadn't been maintained since the late 90s. They told me parts of it were wiped out by landslides, which might explain why it disappeared. They couldn't explain the cabin. It wasn't on their records. I think about that hike a lot. I think about how easily I got lost, how fast things changed. I wasn't stupid. I had a map, a compass, a GPS watch. I told someone where I was going. I didn't take dumb risks, but the forest doesn't care. You twist one joint, started as a solo trip, the kind of hike I'd been meaning to do for over a year. The plan was simple. Take a long weekend, drive up early Friday morning, park at the trailhead near the edge of the national forest, and spend 3 days hiking a stretch of rugged trail that wound through the mountains and back down to a separate exit point, where I'd catch a rideshare back to the car. It wasn't even a remote trail by most standards. It was listed on a dozen hiking sites, had a few reviews, and even a few outdated YouTube videos. Some people called it beautiful. Others called it difficult. One called it dangerous if you took the wrong side trail. That didn't bother me. I prepared well. I packed freeze-dried meals, a compact sleeping pad, 2 water bottles, a small water filter pump, extra batteries, a phone charger, a topo map, and a full tank of gas. I had a cheap tent and a good pair of boots. I even had a GPS watch that marked my location every hour, just in case. I told my cousin the general area I'd be hiking in, sent a screenshot of the trail on Google Maps, and told him I'd check in late Sunday. It was routine. I've hiked alone before. When I reached the trailhead, the sun was just coming up over the tree line. The air smelled like pine needles and dry dust. There was only one other car in the lot, a rusty old pickup that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The driver's side window was down, and inside I saw 2 empty fast food cups in the cup holder and a blanket crumpled on the seat. I ignored it. Probably some hunter who'd walked deep in and was camping without a permit. It happened all the time out there. I stretched my legs and adjusted the straps on my backpack. I locked the car, double-checked the back pocket for the keys, and stepped into the woods. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail was wide enough to be comfortable, covered in a mix of dirt and gravel, sloping gently upward as it passed through tall pine trees. Every few minutes, I passed blue blazes painted on trees, trail markers that let me know I was on the right path. I stopped around noon at a flat rock outcrop with a view of a valley below. I ate a protein bar, took a few pictures, and moved on. The trail started to narrow and curve more after that, winding around ridges and cutting through denser parts of the forest. I passed a small creek where I refilled my bottle and kept going until the sun dropped low. I found a flat clearing near the edge of a small hill and pitched the tent. That first night was quiet, a bit cold, but peaceful. I heard some animal noises in the distance, probably deer or maybe even elk, but nothing too close. I ate one of the freeze-dried meals, boiled water with a little stove, and crawled into my sleeping bag before dark. I barely slept, but not because I was scared, just a mix of nerves and excitement. The next day was when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious. The morning was fine. I broke camp, stuffed everything into the pack, and started walking again. The terrain got steeper, and the switchbacks became tighter. The air smelled different, too. Not piney anymore, but sort of stale and earthy, like wet leaves that never dried. Still, I was making good time. I had planned to reach a spot marked Miner's Notch on the map, an old section of trail that passed near some collapsed mine shafts and was supposed to have a decent view. I reached the notch around early afternoon, but the view wasn't much. Trees had grown up around it, and everything looked the same in every direction. Just endless green ridges and dips. I checked the map again, ate a little, and noticed a faint trail cutting off to the left of the main one. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked used. It had the kind of wear that only comes from boots and weather. It seemed like a shortcut, one that might shave an hour off the next stretch of switchbacks. I paused there for a long time, staring at it. I don't know why I took it. I just did. The turnoff led steeply downhill, and it felt wrong almost immediately. It was narrow and the footing was loose. Small rocks kept sliding out under my boots, and I had to grab onto saplings to steady myself. The trees closed in tighter. Smelled even more stale down there. Damp, rotten. The trail, if it was even that, dipped through a small dry creek bed and then rose again sharply. I kept expecting to see a blue blaze or some sign of maintenance, but there was nothing. Still, I pushed forward, thinking it would reconnect with the main trail soon. But it didn't. After about 40 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen a single blaze or marker. I stopped and tried to check the GPS watch, but the signal was spotty. The dot showed my location, but it was just sitting in a green blur with no trail lines nearby. I pulled out the paper map, tried to match the shape of the land to it, and couldn't figure out where I was. Every ridge looked the same. That's when I heard the first noise. Not an animal, not wind. It was a short, sharp clicking sound. Came from somewhere ahead and to the right up the hill. It was followed by a low thud, then silence again. I stood still for maybe 5 minutes, straining to hear anything else. Nothing came. I finally kept moving, but slower now, more cautious. Every few steps I stopped to listen, heart pounding harder than before. I climbed a steep incline covered in loose pine needles and reached a small plateau. And that's when I saw it. A backpack, just sitting against a tree. It was old, one of those faded orange frame packs from the 90s. The fabric was sun-bleached and fraying. One of the zippers had been chewed open, probably by animals. Nearby, half covered in leaves, I saw a cracked plastic water bottle and a shredded flannel sleeve. I didn't see bones or anything like that, but it didn't feel right. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there staring at it, frozen. Something about it made me feel like I wasn't alone out there. I turned around and started back the way I came. Or at least I thought I did. The trail was gone. The exact path I had walked, the loose rocks, the bend in the trees, the small dip in the terrain, it was all gone or looked completely different now. Every hill looked like the last. The shadows had shifted. The sun was lower, orange, casting weird slants across the forest floor. I didn't panic right away. I tried climbing to higher ground to get a better view. Maybe I could spot the ridge I'd come from. But every direction looked the same. Ridges, trees, shadows. No trail.
No clearing.
No sign of anything. I kept moving. I tried following the downhill path, figuring that at some point I'd hit a stream or creek, and that might lead to a trail. I walked for over an hour. My legs were starting to ache. The soles of my boots were sore. My throat was dry even though I had water. That's when I found the rope. It was hanging from a tree, just a short, thick rope tied into a loop. Not a noose, not exactly, but too deliberately placed to be anything else. The bark under the knot had been worn smooth, like it had been used multiple times. Below it, the ground had been cleared a little, like someone had kicked dirt around. I didn't go closer. I just stared at it, heart pounding so hard I thought I might throw up. I took a step back, then another, and then I heard it again, that clicking sound. But this time it was closer, much closer, sharp, deliberate, like metal on metal. I turned and ran. I didn't care what direction anymore. I just needed to be away from that place. I sprinted downhill, branches slapping my arms, loose soil sliding under my feet. I stumbled, fell once, got back up, kept running. I finally collapsed near the bottom of a shallow ravine, breathing so hard my chest hurt. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I pulled out the map again. Useless. I checked the GPS. The battery was down to 9%. Still no signal. I sat there as the light faded completely, and the forest went dark. That night was the worst of my life. I didn't set up the tent. I didn't eat. I just lay curled up in my sleeping bag against the base of a tree, holding my small knife in one hand, shaking at every noise. There were dozens of them, branches cracking, leaves crunching, sometimes that sharp click in the distance. I didn't sleep. I don't think I even closed my eyes. The first light, I climbed again. I moved slow and tried to stay in straight lines. I stopped every hour to mark a spot on the map as best I could. Around noon, I finally found something familiar. A cluster of fallen trees I remembered passing the day before. I kept climbing, and then, without warning, I stumbled back onto the trail. It didn't feel real. I was suddenly standing on a wide, smooth path. A blue blaze marked a tree nearby. I almost cried. I didn't stop. I kept walking for hours past the next ridge, past the last water stop, all the way to the exit trailhead. My legs were shaking. My throat burned. My body felt like it had been hit by a car. But I made it. I got there just after sunset. There was a small ranger cabin near the exit point, but it was locked and empty. I sat on the bench outside until a couple hiking in from the opposite direction offered me a ride back to my car. I didn't say much. I just sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window, trying not to think. When we reached the trailhead, I had been planning the solo hike for months. I didn't really have a reason, not one I could explain well. Maybe I just wanted to get away for a while. My job had been eating me alive, and my sleep was garbage. I'd been waking up early for no reason, going to bed late, and getting annoyed at the smallest things. People irritated me more than usual. I was short with everyone and everything felt loud. I needed some quiet. I needed time alone in nature, just trees and dirt and maybe some clean air. So I picked a spot far from anything familiar. Somewhere in Idaho, a trail that wasn't too popular, but not too unknown either. I didn't want to be completely off the map, just far enough to not see anyone for a few days. I found a place called Wolfback Trail. It wasn't on many major hiking blogs, which I liked. There were some forum posts about it, mostly from a few years back. People said it was peaceful, not too hard, with some nice views if you got deep enough in. That's all I needed. I didn't care about the views as much as just being alone. I drove for a day and a half from my place in Oregon to get there. By the time I reached the Forest Service Road, my legs were stiff and my neck was sore. I remember parking the car near a little clearing with a faded brown sign that said, Wolfback Loop Trailhead. There was no cell service. I expected that. I took a picture of my map and marked where I parked in my notebook. My backpack was fully packed, tent, food for 6 days, water filters, flashlight, small first aid kit, bear spray, small hatchet, and a simple camp stove. I didn't bring anything fancy, just basics. I didn't plan to make fires or do anything dumb. I just wanted to hike in, spend a few nights deep in the woods, and hike out. The first day felt great. The air was clean. The smell of pine and dirt was sharp in my nose. My boots crunched through leaves and rocks as I moved uphill. The trail wasn't too steep but had steady inclines. I saw some animal tracks early on, deer mostly, a few coyote. Nothing fresh. I hiked for about 6 hours, stopped to eat some jerky and trail mix, and then found a nice flat area to set up my tent before the sun started going down. That first night was calm. I heard some rustling outside the tent after dark, probably a raccoon or a rabbit. I didn't sleep great, but that was normal for me the first night outdoors. I usually sleep better the second night. When I got up around 6:30 the next morning, there was dew on everything. I boiled some water for coffee, had an energy bar, packed up, and started moving again. The second day, I went deeper into the trail, but I wasn't sure if I was still on the loop. The trail markers were spaced far apart, and one of the wooden posts I passed had fallen over and rotted. I checked the sun often to make sure I was still heading northeast. I wasn't worried, just more alert. I could always turn back if I needed to, and I had enough food and water. But something felt off later that afternoon. I came across a side path I hadn't noticed on any maps. It wasn't wide, but it was clearly man-made. Not like an animal trail. It had boot prints. Not fresh, maybe a few days old. I hesitated at first, but something in me wanted to follow it. Maybe just out of curiosity. It curved away from the main trail through a thick patch of brush. I pushed through it and followed the narrow path for maybe 30 minutes. It went downhill sharply and dropped into a ravine. That's when I saw the man. He was lying on his side against a tree, legs stretched out, like he had just fallen there. He wore a gray jacket and dark hiking pants. His backpack was still on. At first, I thought he might be asleep or unconscious, but as I got closer, I could tell by how stiff his arms looked that he'd been dead a while. The skin on his face was pale. His lips were slightly open, dry, cracked. His eyes were closed. I could smell him before I got too close. I backed up. My first thought was to get out of there and report it, but I had no signal. I looked around. There was no sign of blood or a struggle. I didn't see a weapon or anything that looked like a fall injury. It was too far from any real drop. He might have had a medical issue. Heart attack maybe. Stroke. He didn't look old, maybe late 30s. No visible wounds. I stood there for a long time, just staring, trying to make sense of it. Something about the way his body rested against the tree didn't sit right. It didn't look like he collapsed naturally. His head was leaning too straight, like it had been positioned, and his boots were missing, just socks. His feet pointed out stiffly, like he'd been moved. That's when I saw a second trail behind him, very faint, like someone had dragged something heavy up it. I don't scare easily, but my stomach turned. I backed away slowly, not turning my back fully. I felt like I was being watched. The woods around the ravine were dense and quiet. No wind.
No birds.
I hadn't noticed how silent it had gotten until that moment. I didn't follow the second trail. I went back the way I came, but I walked faster, almost jogging. I moved uphill back to the main path and kept going without stopping. I looked behind me more than once. Every sound made me freeze. A snapping twig, a gust of wind. I kept checking the trees, expecting to see someone there, but I didn't. I hiked for another 2 hours and didn't see anyone. I pitched my tent again, but I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing sounds, branches cracking, distant footsteps, or maybe I imagined them. At one point, I turned off my flashlight and just sat in the dark, listening. The silence was worse. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I packed and decided to hike out early. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. I just wanted to get back to the car and tell someone about the body. I marked the spot in my notebook as best I could using the rough landmarks. The broken birch tree, the shape of the ravine, the side trail. I figured I'd hand it to the forest rangers. That third day felt longer than the others. I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps behind me. A few times I stopped and listened hard. Nothing, but it was like something was following me at a distance, keeping to the trees. I was sure of it. The path back didn't feel the same either. Some of the trail markers were gone. I know that sounds crazy, but I didn't see the rotted post again. The turnoff I had taken the day before wasn't where I thought it was. The branches looked bent differently, like someone had brushed over the trail. Around noon, I noticed new boot prints in the dirt. Big ones, not mine. Heavier, deeper. They overlapped my older prints. Someone had been behind me. Recently, I started walking faster. My breath got tight. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was close. I kept the bear spray in my hand, safety cap off. I scanned every shadow, every branch. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind a thick pine trunk, maybe 50 feet back. Just a flash of gray, then nothing. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I started to doubt myself. Maybe the prints were mine. Maybe I'd looped back. Maybe I was just panicking. I stopped at a clearing and looked around for something familiar. I saw nothing. The trees all looked the same. I checked my compass. Still pointed west. But I should have been seeing the end of the loop. The trailhead wasn't that far. I kept going. I told myself just to keep walking west, and eventually I'd hit the road. I had food left, enough water. I was physically fine, just tired. The fourth day started with a headache. I woke up dizzy. I had dreamed something was crouching outside the tent, just breathing slowly, waiting. I kept thinking about the body, how still it was, how wrong it looked. That blank face, half hidden in shadow. No boots, drag marks. I didn't even make coffee. I just packed up and started moving again. My goal was simple, get out. But the trail was gone. I mean, it was really gone. No markers, no worn dirt, nothing. I must have veered off without noticing, or maybe the trail had changed somehow. I don't know. I started pushing through brush, just going in a straight line. The trees grew tighter the farther I went, like the forest was closing in. I scratched my arms and face on low branches. My clothes were damp with sweat. I kept thinking I heard someone behind me. A cough, a crunch, always just behind. By mid-afternoon, I saw something hanging from a tree branch up ahead. I slowed down. It was a boot, just one, hanging from a thick limb by its shoelace. Worn, torn at the heel. I didn't stop, couldn't. I pushed past it. About an hour later, I found a second one, placed neatly on a stump. Same kind of boot. I didn't check the size. I just kept walking. At that point, I stopped looking at the compass. I didn't care what direction I was going. I just wanted to move. I didn't set up my tent that night. I just sat against a tree, too scared to close my eyes. I kept the bear spray in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I barely blinked. When daylight came, I was still there. My throat was dry. I'd run out of water. I filtered. I needed to get away from everything. Work had been chewing me up for months. My sleep was ruined. My appetite had changed. I started feeling like a stranger to my own body, like I was living someone else's life and just pretending it was mine. I couldn't remember the last time I felt calm. I wasn't depressed, at least I didn't think I was. But something about the constant noise, the messages, the alarms, the traffic, the meetings, the faces everywhere, it just made me want to disappear. I decided to take a week off and head out into the mountains. I picked a range that wasn't too well known, a few hours' drive north of where I lived. It had a few trails on all trails, a couple of warnings about loose rock, bears, not a lot of water access, but nothing dangerous if you prepared right. That was the whole point. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear into the trees and lose my name for a while. No phone, no people, just walking, cooking over a fire, sleeping early, and feeling the wind. I packed everything carefully. I wasn't new to hiking. I had done a few multi-day treks before, but this time I wanted to be alone, really alone. I brought a high-capacity pack, lightweight tent, compact sleeping bag, 2 fire-starting kits, a small camp stove, dehydrated meals for a week, bear spray, a decent first aid kit, a knife, backup flashlight, headlamp, 2 battery packs, and a laminated topo map with marked trails and a few possible water sources. My phone would be turned off the whole time, but I brought it in case of an emergency. I also left a written plan with a friend just in case, the kind where you write down your route, start and end days, and tell them to call for help if they don't hear from you by the end of the week. I left early on a Sunday morning. The drive was long and quiet. As I got closer to the trailhead, the roads narrowed and twisted through dense pine forests. I didn't see another car for a long stretch, which felt good. The farther I got, the better I felt. No music, no podcast, just the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the trees rushing by. The trailhead was at a gravel pull-off just past a ranger station that was clearly unmanned. It looked like no one had used the parking area in a while. No other cars, no fresh footprints. I checked everything one last time, pulled my pack on, locked the car, and stepped onto the trail. The first day was peaceful. A little warm, but the shade helped. The terrain wasn't too tough. Mostly rolling hills, pine needles underfoot, the smell of tree sap and dry grass. I didn't see anyone all day, which was perfect. I made it about 10 miles in and camped on a flat rise overlooking a narrow valley. The air got cooler as the sun dropped. I set up my tent, boiled water for a meal, and ate while sitting on a flat rock facing the west. I watched the light fade and the sky go orange, then dark blue, then almost black with just a streak of deep red along the horizon. I crawled into my sleeping bag early and fell asleep fast. The kind of sleep that's hard to find in cities, deep and undisturbed. The second day was longer and harder. I was headed into a section of the range with fewer trail markings, and the path became less obvious. It wound through a stretch of forest where everything looked the same. There were old burn marks on some of the trunks, probably from a fire years ago. The sun kept moving behind clouds and then coming out again. I lost the trail a few times, but found it again by using the map and following the shape of the land. I started to feel like I was being watched once or twice, but I chalked it up to being alone and maybe over-aware of every sound. Birds, squirrels, wind, branches creaking. It all seemed louder than usual, but nothing really felt wrong. I found a good spot that night by a small stream. The water was moving fast and clear, perfect for filtering. I cooked again, changed into dry clothes, and set up my tent beside a cluster of thick shrubs. It was a little colder that night, and I built a small fire to sit by while I dried out my socks. Again, I felt something, like the woods were paying attention to me, but I kept brushing it off. Just nerves. I was alone. That was the whole point. You can't ask for solitude and then panic when you feel it. The third day was where things started to change. It didn't feel like one big moment. It came in small pieces. I woke up before dawn to the sound of something snapping. Not a branch breaking from the wind. This was sharper, like a stick being stepped on. I lay still inside the tent, holding my breath. The woods were quiet except for the stream. I unzipped the tent just a little and looked out. Nothing, just trees and gray light and fog. I stayed awake after that, packed up earlier than usual and got moving. By late morning, I found what looked like a trail, but it wasn't on my map. It was faint, like it hadn't been used in a long time, almost hidden under pine needles. It looked like it had been a game trail, or maybe even a forgotten route once marked by rangers. I stood at the edge of it for a while, trying to decide. The map trail looped west and then north, adding maybe another day. This offshoot looked like it cut straight north. It would be harder, steeper, but faster. I decided to follow it. That was a mistake. The path was tight. Trees grew close together. Sometimes I had to turn sideways to move between them. The ground sloped up steeply, and I had to use both hands at times to climb sections with exposed roots. My legs started to burn. My back hurt. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something that didn't fit. A crushed can wedged between two rocks. Not rusted, not sun-bleached. Shiny, like it had been dropped maybe a week ago. The label was faded but still readable. It wasn't one of mine. I picked it up and looked around. The trail was barely there anymore, and the light was starting to fade. I pushed on another half-mile, then made camp beside a boulder field that looked like it had slid down the mountain years ago. That night, I barely slept. Something was off. I kept hearing noises, short, quick steps, pauses, then more steps. I kept unzipping the tent and shining my headlamp out into the dark, but I never saw anything. Just shadows, trees, fog. I even scanned for eye shine. Nothing. Around 3 a.m., I heard something brushing the side of the tent, like a hand moving across it. Slow, almost careful. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then it was gone. I left at sunrise. By day 4, I wasn't hiking anymore. I was trying to get out. The trail had vanished completely. I followed my compass and the map, trying to descend back toward the main loop, but the terrain was broken, steep, and confusing. I had to go slow, and I kept hearing things. The worst part wasn't the sound, it was the silence right after. Like something knew when I stopped and waited. Like it was waiting too. I found more signs. A boot print near a dry creek bed, larger than mine, deep, too deep for how dry the ground was. I thought maybe it was old, left when the ground was wet, but it hadn't rained in days. Then I found a piece of torn cloth snagged on a branch. Blue, like denim, not mine. It looked frayed on one side, not a clean rip. I started scanning the trees constantly. I didn't eat lunch. I didn't stop moving. I just wanted to get out. That evening, I didn't set up camp. I found a shallow depression under a cluster of rocks, just wide enough to lie in. I didn't pitch my tent. I just rolled out my sleeping bag and stayed half-dressed, boots on, pack ready to go. I kept my headlamp around my neck and held the bear spray in my right hand. At some point, I heard breathing. Not an animal, not deep or huffing. Slow, steady, like someone trying not to make noise. I sat up, heart pounding, turned my headlamp on and pointed it toward the noise. The beam lit up trees, rocks, a fallen log, and nothing else. I stayed like that for almost 2 hours, not blinking, not speaking, just staring into the dark. On the 5th day, I finally saw it. I was climbing a ridge to get a better view of the valley below, hoping to spot the main trail or maybe even the parking lot. I got to the top, sweating and shaking, and looked down. I saw something move in the trees, a shape, human-sized, but not walking, crouched, watching me. I froze. It didn't move. I blinked. Still there. I lifted my arm slowly and pointed the headlamp at it. The light flicked across branches, and the shape was gone. I ran. I didn't care about falling. I didn't care about injuries. I just needed to get away. I scrambled down the other side of the ridge, sliding through loose dirt and broken branches, crashing through underbrush. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I lay in the dirt, chest heaving, ears ringing, hands trembling. Later that day, I heard something behind me again, a slow rustle, then silence, then the same rustle just a bit closer. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking. By dusk, I found what looked like an old logging road, overgrown but still wide enough to follow. I stuck to it, moving as fast as I could. On the 6th day, I saw a sign nailed to a tree, weathered, faded. It said trailhead 3.5 miles, with an arrow pointing downhill.